for not only sharing your music here this evening, but also participating in this time of worship and leading us in worship. I'm so thankful. Come, thou long-expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart. Come, thou long-expected Jesus, written by both Charles and John Wesley, one of the many carols that the two of them collaborated on. As you listen to the words, "Come, thou long-expected Jesus," I think there's something that you should know about this family. See, the Wesleys did not grow up in a perfect household. In fact, in today's world, their household might have been deemed dysfunctional. John and Charles came from a dysfunctional family. Their father, Samuel, was a minister, but his ministry was not very successful. His church was not filled with people, and people weren't very fond of him. Not only that, but Samuel and his wife Susanna had 19 children in all, 10 survived. Samuel was not only a clergy person, but he decided as a second career to become a poet as well, because we all know that's a big financial boost in a person's life. As a clergy person, he was not only challenged by being liked in the community, but this also impacted the family's finances as well. So he needed this secondary income. And at one point, he did write a poem for the Queen, and she took note. But he is what we would call today a one-hit wonder, and his poetry never really caught on. Some said he had a problem with money, spending, saving, and oh yes, by the way, feeding 10 children. But in the end, he had debts. And his debts would land him in debtor's prison, leaving the children to be reared by Susanna. Eventually, Samuel would die penniless. Now, Mother Susanna Wesley wore many hats. She not only served in both the role as mother and father, but also took on the role as pastor when she was challenged by the pastor in his teachings. She became a spiritual advisor and a teacher. I have a feeling that she had a pretty domineering role in their household. She raised her children in a time when children were not independent to do indeed be independent, and would test them weekly, not only on their educational well-being, but their spiritual soundness as well. Now, as I learn more about this family and the amazing accomplishments in their life, I wonder, what must it have been like to have been a Wesley child? I mean, challenges with the community, not being respected, people not liking the Wesleys, a domineering mother, a demand for excellence, and oh yeah, by the way, dad's in jail. I think if the Wesley children had lived in the 21st century, at least some of those 10 children would be in therapy today. In fact, I'm wondering if maybe what Charles was looking at in putting the words to this song, "Come Thou Long-Expected Jesus," was him trying to find a little bit of hope in the midst of dysfunction. He was waiting for life to be different. When Charles wrote this hymn in 1744, he was living in a world where he was surrounded by poverty and orphans and impossible situations for the lower class. Not only in the midst of his ministry did he see pain and suffering, but in his own way, he knew it. He knew it personally. He could identify with not having enough money or food to eat or a father to care for you. You hear it when he simply says, "Come, Jesus, into the darkness and bring me some joy." If Chuck, as I'm sure we'd call him today, were alive, I think he may have written this first verse like this. "Come, thou long expected Jesus, born to sit in the dark with me. From my fears and pain release me. Let me find some rest in thee. Give me strength and consolation, hope in darkness to provide. Bring light in my way, in pain and suffering, peace and joy for my longing heart." The purpose of a longest night service is to gather on the longest night of the year in the winter solstice. In the midst of darkness, we gather together. We pray and we lift one another up. Wow. I mean, so much has happened in this past year. A year ago on winter solstice, you were not here. Last December, we were living in this strange new land, being apart from one another at Christmas. We were dumbfounded by these staggering numbers in death from COVID, 330,000 people, an unimaginable loss. Amazing to think here we are today, vaccinated and making some great advancements. Yet that staggering number from last year, it's grown to over 800,000 this year. On December 15th in the National Cathedral in Washington, they rang the bells out 800 times, one time for every 1,000 deaths, mourning and marking loss from COVID. It took over 80 minutes to do so. We have experienced so much loss in this past year. I knew early on in the pandemic that this was going to be a time like no other around death. Not long before we had the shutdown, I was called to stand in for a young pastor who was scheduled to do a funeral. His wife was just too uncomfortable with him doing a funeral in the midst of this new virus. And it really concerned her about how this virus might impact their young children. Within a couple of weeks, we went from traditional funerals to doing only graveside services. In fact, I can remember doing a service at the beginning of COVID, 20 people at a time graveside, the same service 3 times for over 60 people. Soon thereafter, I mean, within a week, we were doing services in empty rooms, maybe 1 or 2 people, but most people attending on streaming in their homes. Many funerals and memorials were put on hold, and others just never happened or were canceled. By now, you would think we would be returning to life as we know it, traditional life celebrations, but guess what? It is still unfolding. We're waiting as a new way of recognizing loss and celebrating life eternal is still being established. On the longest night, I wish to acknowledge that we are waiting for our new normal. Not only are there COVID-related deaths, but there is the darkness of losing loved ones during this time. Nurses and hospital staff became our communicators with screens and family members saying goodbye to loved ones. Family members having to wait to say goodbye on a hospital schedule, and the amazing staff that worked to facilitate that. As Andrew noted, in our own family, Andrew's mother, Rosemary, became ill, and there were issues around having to wait, waiting to travel, me not being able to travel as I did not have a British passport or a valid reason to leave the country. And then Andrew flying over and waiting a mandatory 10 days all alone, unable to be with anyone in quarantine. All of this waiting led to limited time to be together with his family, limited time to be with his mother, and not knowing if this goodbye was the last goodbye. On a side note, I wish to thank the Roberts Park family for all the love, care, and support you provided during this incredibly challenging time for Andrew. Believe me, the love was felt from thousands of miles away, and we are all so very thankful for the love and support. During this past year, 2021, in the U.S. alone, do you know, in addition to those 800,000 deaths, we had another 2.3 million deaths. These deaths were from things called natural causes, or heart disease, or cancer, or respiratory infections, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, poisoning, kidney disease. Suicides are up, homicide, liver disease, falls, firearms, sepsis, car accidents, Parkinson's, HIV, AIDS. These are real losses, but there are other losses as well. There has been the waiting to be together and the loss around having a clear understanding of what that exactly looks like these days. There's the pain and loss that comes with losing a family member after not being with them for months and months, and the complicated grief that comes with that. There are the losses in relationships, our differences growing over social media. There have been divorces. There have been letting children go and experiencing a new form of empty nest. There is the loss of job or the way of life. The loss of our school years with our children and the programs and the graduations and the life passages. And still, in the midst of all of this, we are waiting. We are waiting in our loss for a new way of being. I'm not Wesley, but perhaps this is the year I understand in a different way. Come, thou long expected Jesus, come and sit in the dark with me, because we're alone, we're tired, and we are weary. Grief is real because loss is real. Kubler-Ross in Stages of Grief once said that, and I'm going to say it again. Grief is real because loss is real. Unlike loss, though, where you have one less at the table, grief doesn't come with an empty chair to see something physically. With grief, we don't wear a sign that says, "Yep, I'm grieving." We just are here in this strange land where we're waiting for life to be different. Now, with that said, grief indeed does show up, doesn't it? Grief shows up and it wears us down, and we carry it with us. Even when others don't know it's there, oh, it's there. And oftentimes it's waiting for us to acknowledge it's there. For there is a burden to bear with grief. The burden of grief. Perhaps that's why in the gospel that was read earlier from Matthew, Jesus answers that burden question by saying, "Come to me, all who are weary and carrying a heavy burden, and I will give you rest." Jesus says to all of us, hey, give me that, and I'll carry it for you. And perhaps tonight, some of you may be in that place where you can accept Jesus carrying your burden. But I also want to recognize that there are still many others who are saying, "Come, thou long-expected Jesus. Release me from the darkness. I'm waiting. I'm tired. I'm lonely." A number of years ago, a friend shared a story with me. She was a waitress in a busy restaurant. And in that restaurant, there was this huge freezer way in the back. And it was a freezer that the staff had to go to periodically to refill the dessert wheel. Remember dessert wheels? They had famous desserts, so on a daily basis, there were a couple of staff people that had to visit that freezer a couple of times. And it was just so happened to be my friend's job. And I have to tell you, she did not like that freezer. Because if you were not careful, that freezer door would slam behind you and you would get stuck. The place was so busy when this happened sometime, well, you could be stuck in there for a really long time. So she was always very careful to make sure that she put something in the door to ensure it would not close on her and she would end up in the dark. She did her best to protect herself from getting locked in the dark. But then one day, without her thinking, it happened. She went in, the door slammed behind her, and she was in the dark. I mean the dark, pitch black dark. At first she thought, I can handle this darkness. So she pounded on the door and yelled, "Hey guys, I'm here in the dark." But no one heard her, or at least they never came to help. Then she remembered, oh, there's a light. There is a light in this freezer. So she started reaching for the string to the light in the darkness. And the more she reached and the more she moved around, the more confused she became, and she lost her sense of right and left and up and down. And she was in the dark, and she was cold, and she was freaked out, and she was overwhelmed, and no one was coming. She was swinging around and trying to find the light, and then she lost her footing and she began to fall, and then she fell, and she fell hard and landed on a pallet. By this time, she was lost. She was in absolute tears and totally burdened. She thought even momentarily that she was going to die. Then, in the silence, she heard a voice, perhaps even her own, saying, "Be still. Just breathe." As she began to breathe, the tears started subsiding. The panic left. She focused on her breathing, and as she did, she noticed something from the corner of her eye. It wasn't much, but there was just a little bit of light. Not much. A little bit of light coming from under the crack in the door. So she focused her eyes on that little bit of light, and she breathed in. She found in this not the promise that someone was going to open the door, but the promise that there is light out there. And that is where she found hope while waiting. Together, as we gather in this place, let's just breathe. While the frenzy of this season continues for the next few days, let's just breathe. As we consider the days ahead and one less at the table, or family members not able to get here, let's just breathe. As you consider the burden of grief that you have, just breathe. It is dark, but the calendar tells us that the days will soon get longer again. So breathe. And once you're breathing, then take a moment and start looking for the light. It doesn't have to be a lot of light. Look for a sliver of light. a little bit of light. It might indeed be in here, which would be beautiful. But it might still be out there, which is okay, because you can breathe and say, "Come, thou now long expected Jesus. Come and sit in the dark with me." You may not know he's there, but I promise you he is. Friends, the light might be going over you. The light might be going around you. The light might be before you and behind you. You may not see it, but he promised it's there. So just breathe and say, "Come, thou long expected Jesus." I'm waiting. I'm breathing. I'm remembering that sliver of light and having faith that darkness does not overcome it. Amen.